Chapter 8. Arthur. Arthur jogged along the valley towards the village. The last sun rays of the fading summer caressed his face and the involuntary proud grin he wore. He carried a dead rabbit he had slain during the hunt. His moderate shooting skills improved with every year, and his father had sent him as a messenger to the village to brag and announce dinner preparations to his mother. Arthur was the only one amongst his friends who enjoyed the hunt. Sana was too sensitive, and John plainly detested it. Sometimes he was glad. John possessed a natural talent for the hunt, a feeling for the animals, an instinct of sorts, and an eye of an eagle when it came to shooting. He didn't need yet another reason to envy John. On the other hand, Arthur was alone in the woods amongst experienced men while the boys chit-chatted during their work in the fields. But today, he was proud of his accomplishments. For once, his father had not sent him home early as a punishment. He was still at least half a mile from the village that spread out on the backdrop of the mountains. It looked mostly empty. Fieldwork would go on until sunset, and only some women and elderly remained there this time of day. Suddenly, he thought he saw a shape walking towards the village from the south. He blinked, panic rising inside of him. Should he run back and tell his father? But when he looked closer, he noticed the figure was limping, holding on to his or her right hand as if in pain. Arthur ran faster. As he got closer, he could make out the figure of a girl, maybe in her early 20s. The wind gently whipped her luxurious silk hair, which was the colour of a spring tulip. She slowly limped towards the huts, wearing ill-fitting city clothes. An old beige coat that had seen better days, tight black jeans with frayed edges and large scuff marks from trudging through mud, and seemingly impractical black boots coated in dirt and grime. Her face was pale and gaunt, as if she hadn't slept for days. She swiveled in his direction, and when he met her gaze, he was entranced. The girl was breathtaking with her delicate features and freckled complexion. More girls his age lived in the village, but he thought he had never seen one as beautiful. There was something about her, an unknown danger, an uncertainty that she suddenly brought into his life. Suddenly, without warning, she fell onto the grass before him. Snapping out of his surprise, he ran to her side, kneeling and finding that she was breathing heavily, her eyes staring off into the sky. "Are you all right?" he murmured. "Hey!" He touched her shoulder, and she shrunk back, as if she had just now sensed his presence. How ill was she? The girl opened those thin lips with a heavy breath and whispered, "Water." Arthur nodded. "Come on, let's get you to the village." While he spoke, he helped her get up from the grass. An arm around her shoulders, the other still carrying the dead animal, he slowly walked her to his house. He noticed that the back of her right hand bled from a deep cut. She had cut out her chip, a girl from the cities, the first one he ever met. It became a long and exhausting walk where she threatened to collapse with every step. Arthur's heart beat heavily against his chest, and he was very aware of her tender but muscular shape touching his. He scolded himself for the improper thought, but could do nothing about it. He barely could withstand the urge to stare at this girl non-stop. The leader's hall lay at the centre of the village. It was built just like a black house, with a turf roof, but with wooden walls instead of stone. It was much larger and could at times accommodate the whole village when they gathered for a feast. The private chambers of the hall were in the far back, separated by curtains, decorated with wool and fur. John stood at the far end of the village, at his doorstep, putting on his boots to get back to the fields. He caught a glimpse of Arthur, and his eyes persistently lingered on the girl. Arthur felt like time stood still for a moment when their eyes met, and somehow John's stare infuriated him. Was he only imagining it? The moment was gone as fast as it came, but it awoke an itch in Arthur's heart. Jealousy? They barely passed the hall's doorsill when his mother, a strong and mostly quiet woman, ran towards them. The girl collapsed when Arthur tried to sit her down at the table and ran for a jar of water. He had to force it between her lips. She looked even paler, barely able to perceive her surroundings. The itch in Arthur's heart worsened. Would she die? The water still fresh between her lips. Her eyes fell shut, and she crashed to the ground before Arthur could catch her. Arthur's mother felt her pulse, her forehead, then nodded. "She's just dehydrated. Give her some hours of sleep." Arthur nodded, not fully convinced, and took her tender form into his arms, carrying her to the back of the hall with a protective instinct foreign to him. He placed her into the soft fur and stared at her for a moment longer. Her strikingly red hair fell down her shoulders and waist, and her chest slowly rose and fell. The feeling that warmed his gut at her sight scared him. Was he in love? He had been before, but it hadn't felt anything like it. You're a fool. She is nothing but a stranger. He forced himself to tear his eyes away from her stunning form, but even while he left, he knew that she would haunt him. When his father heard of the stranger, his mood shifted abruptly. Arthur knew that while he was a likable and warm character around trusted friends, he disapproved of every stranger who entered their village. But he didn't care. He had done the right thing, and he refused to let his mood be spoiled. Finally, Arthur heard the long-desired steps from the private rooms. When she descended from the chambers, the girl looked so different and startling that Arthur had to suppress a gasp. She had put on the clothes his mother laid out for her, a long skirt, warm leather boots garnished with fur, and a long dark coat made of wool that would keep her warm in the coming autumn nights. She had washed and tied her hair into a ponytail. It still fell elegantly on her shoulders. She carried her head high, not avoiding the faces that stared at her but studying them. Her green eyes stared at Arthur with interest, and it was he who tore his glance away because he could not bear it any longer. He scolded himself for this, and his eyes wandered involuntarily back to her, as if attracted by a magnetizing force. His father's deep voice broke the silence. "Sit down. Eat." His head hinted towards an empty seat next to Arthur's mother, and Arthur felt the invitation was cold and investigative. The girl hesitated only for a second. Then the hunger got the better of her. The meat smelled delicious from the fireplace, and she swallowed the bite offered to her with no consideration for manners. Except for her chewing, the room had fallen back to the familiar silence. When she was done, Alasdair poured some ale into her wooden jar and sipped on his. "So, what brings you here?" Arthur grew furious. Couldn't he see how fragile and helpless she was? How scared? His father made it sound as if she involuntarily stumbled here on a pleasant late afternoon walk. "My name is Aideen." Aideen. It was the first time he properly heard her voice. What did it remind him of? The song of the most beautiful nightingale. Arthur cringed at this thought. He was going completely nuts. The blood from the back of her hand was gone, but the deep cut was still fresh and the bruised skin red with inflammation. "Pull yourself together," he scolded himself yet again, "and stop staring." His father noticed the stare and gave Arthur a sharp look of warning, but Arthur ignored it. He just couldn't tear his eyes away, even if he wanted to. "I'm from Edinburgh," she added, and fell silent again. A glance at his father's expression gave away that he wasn't buying it. "Edinburgh," he repeated, and paused. "No parents." Arthur noticed those words made her uneasy, but she simply shook her head. "None that I know of." How had it felt to grow up without parents, not knowing where one came from? This was the life of all the city children, born and raised in raising centres by governmental social workers. To Arthur, who had spent his whole life in Area 3, it seemed unnatural. But when he glanced over at his father, the thought of freedom intrigued him. "How old are you, girl?" Arthur instantly knew the purpose of this question. If she was born before the social reform, she had parents who must have given her away to a raising centre. If she was born after, she was just a product of science and DNA donation. 18. So born after the reform. She looked a little older. Did Aideen lie on purpose? Arthur dismissed the thought. Her ordeal in the past days must have matured her looks, but he knew his father did not buy it either. What would he do to her? Drive her out and let her starve? Even he couldn't be that cruel. His father leaned forward, his eyes studying Aideen with the solemn expression Arthur knew too well. He always put it on when a serious conversation was in order. "Tell me why you're here." Arthur suppressed the urge to interrupt his father and protect Aideen from this outrageous accusation, but Aideen did not even flinch. She just let a silent pause settle over them, deciding what to say next. "One of my overseers abused me." Those words stung Arthur. They would hopefully shut up his father. Rumour said abuse and rape were common in these institutions, but they have never heard it firsthand. "He would find me anywhere," he said. Aideen continued. "He would access the data of my chip, and thus my whereabouts years after I reached legal age. I had no other choice but to flee and cut this thing out." A strong wave of rage overcame Arthur, an impulse to kill this bastard who had hurt her, to protect her, whatever the cost. He clenched his fists. "It's been a week since then. I've lived in the neutral area, but after 5 days, my supplies ran out." A cold chill ran down Arthur's spine. The neutral area. Created as a place where both outsiders and city residents could pass legally to cross between cities, it was a set of ghost towns roamed by psychopaths, drug dealers and criminals. How did she even manage to survive it? Alasdair just nodded. It was a cold nod. "I hope you understand the dilemma you put me in." Arthur clenched his fists so hard, the fingers bored deeply into his skin. Dilemma. "If you're telling the truth, I cannot reject you and leave you to the mercy of the gods and nature, let you starve or be killed. But if you're lying, you could put my whole village in danger, the people I am responsible for. I'll need time to find out which of those two it is. Up until then, you will be our prisoner." Arthur jumped up from the table. "A prisoner? But she's—" A look from Alasdair made him shut up, an expression so intimidating Arthur's voice failed him, but only for a second. When his father turned around, courage found him again, and his words came out so loud that he knew it was a mistake. "You can't do this! After all that had happened to her!" Alasdair clenched his huge right hand into a fist and crashed it against the wooden table with such force everything on it rose into the air. "Have your hormones erased everything I have taught you?" he yelled. His voice echoed between the walls, and Arthur was sure that the whole village heard it. He fell silent and lowered his head. This strange sensation slowly crept into his heart, this feeling that always rose when his father rebuked him, as if a small disgusting voice whispered into his ear, "This is who you really are, a disappointment." "Aideen, with me," Alasdair's voice commanded. At least he didn't drag her by the elbow, he just signalled with his head. Both of them left the hall and walked across the village bathed in darkness. But as Arthur watched them disappear into the night, he saw two familiar faces peeking out their huts to see what all the fuss was about, Sena and John. When he was sure his father was out of sight, he ran across the muddy paths and waved them to him. "What happened?" Sena whispered, as the three of them put their heads together to conspire. "We meet here at midnight," Arthur replied in a hushed tone. "I'll explain everything." His friends nodded and whispered one after another. 1, 2, 3. Both Sena and John hurried to leave for their huts, but Arthur followed the footsteps into the direction Aideen had left, with a long gaze. He let out a deep breath. Damn it. He was in love, wasn't he? Chapter 9. Sena. Sena didn't need to tiptoe around the house at midnight, compared to, he was pretty sure, what Arthur did right now. His mother, Margaret, was wide awake and not particularly interested in her son's whereabouts. Maybe because she trusted him, a trust that was mutual. The fire still burned in the middle of the hut, keeping them warm throughout the night. Sena stared at the flames, and his gaze shifted to his mother, who lay on the bed made of straw and fur, eyes fixated on the black ceiling. Nightmares plagued Margaret, so she had nearly given up sleep years ago. Sena pitied her. He could barely tell the exact time of day as thick clouds hid the moon and the stars, but he figured that it was time to go. His woolen socks touched the cold wooden floor. He put on his boots, already half torn from the years of use, and a coat his mother had made him for this winter. "Will you be back soon?" Margaret's voice echoed in the hut. Sena was a little surprised, but he smiled in the half-light of the fire and walked over to kiss her forehead. "I will." "Be careful." She sounded tired. Sena walked out into the cold night, but he only felt the icy wind on his face and around his ears thanks to the coat. Luckily, it was not raining. John stood there already, switching from one foot to the other, wearing only a sweater. His grandfather had to be long asleep by now, a sleep nothing could disrupt so easily. They greeted each other with a slight nod, not uttering the evident suspicion that concerned Arthur's absence. Something had happened tonight in their hall. Sena had only heard the cries, and saw the shape of a girl vanishing with the clan leader into the night. And he was dying to know the meaning of those things. He both admired Arthur's courage and frowned upon his stupidity to steal away the same night. Those were the times he did not envy him for having a father. When John threatened to freeze, and both of them thought of going back home, Arthur came running from the distance, gasping. He carried 2 blankets and a plate with cold meat. There was no need to explain what had caused the delay, and Arthur motioned the boys to follow him into the night. "What's the meaning of all this?" Sena asked impatiently while they walked. "You're always looking for meaning in everything." Arthur mocked him with a grin, and Sena rolled his eyes. Arthur told them the story, concluding with, "I figure my father brought her into this abandoned hut at the edge of the village." "What did you think of her?" Sena wondered, and Arthur hesitated, then just shrugged in response. The shrug seemed more like a defense mechanism. Sena tried to study him, to understand what prompted him to look for a stranger in the middle of the night and defy his father to such an extent. Arthur was a rebel, no question of that. But was this move really only an act of rebellion? Sena had never seen Alastair McKeon as angry as tonight. Meanwhile, John had turned pale. Or was it the moonlight that made him appear that way? John was only that quiet when something bothered him. Sena remembered that night when they had bathed in the lake. The thing that John had told them. A girl. John had dreamed of a girl. A cold chill ran through Sena's body, and suddenly the darkness that lay ahead of them seemed menacing. The hut stood several feet away from the village. It looked tiny, even compared to the small black house Sena inhabited, and it was neglected and uncared for. No fire burned inside, not even a sign of life. Full steam ahead, Arthur walked towards the wooden door and carefully pushed it open. It creaked, and only now Sena noticed a small light that came through the opening. It came from an oil lamp and illuminated the empty space. Empty but for a person sitting in the straw, crouched. As she looked up towards the intruders, the small light of the lamp danced in her deep green eyes. Tiredness marked the girl's expression, but this did not diminish the fascination Sena experienced in her presence. Arthur blushed, handing her the blankets and the plate with the meat. "I hope we didn't wake you." His tone was so shaky that it made Sena wonder. Aideen smiled, gladly accepting the gift and wrapping her tender form into the blankets. "This is very kind." There was something crisp and alluring about her voice. Her left ankle was in a metal chain attached to the floor. Sena didn't even know this chain existed, nor the purpose of this hut up until this day. She really was a prisoner. But was this who they had become? A village that imprisoned helpless girls. A familiar sadness rose in Sena's heart. "You brought a friend?" "Yes, this is Sena and this—" Arthur fell silent. "John?" It was only when John entered the hut that the atmosphere felt heavy, loaded. Maybe it was only because Sena remembered John's dream, and because, judging by the way John's eyes shifted, only slightly, when he glanced upon Aideen, he saw that this was the girl he had dreamed about. John incessantly stared at Aideen, not uttering a word. But inside those grey eyes played out a world of emotions, memories, realities, dreams. Even in the shadow of the hut, Sena saw tears rising in John's eyes. What was it he saw? He remembered. The heaviness lasted for a fleeting moment. "We would like to keep you company, if you don't object." How polite Arthur sounded, as if he courted her. "The longer you stay, the greater the chances your father will discover," Aideen countered with a wink, and Arthur bit on his lips. Sena liked this girl. He liked her a lot. "Well, maybe we should really get going," Arthur said with a smile. "Not that we don't enjoy your astute company." Astute? Where did this word come from? When Aideen smiled back, Sena felt his lungs tighten. "Well, by the looks of it, I have nowhere else to be. Is this how you normally treat guests?" "I'm really sorry." Arthur's voice sunk. "Sometimes my father sees ghosts." Aideen shrugged. "To be blunt, this is the best place I've been to in days, not to mention the food, so I'll be fine." There was this smile again. It enchanted Sena, as did her mood, despite her fate and this impossible situation. "We'll take good care of you," he said, his eyes lingering on her. She nodded, and only slowly her smile faded again, revealing a hint of bitterness. At least that's what Sena thought to perceive in the limited light of the oil lamp. In the meantime, John seemed to have lost the ability to speak, and when Sena looked over to Arthur, He realized that he peered at him with anger flickering in those eyes. "Good night," Arthur murmured. Even those words could not conceal Arthur's sudden shift of mood. But why? Arthur nearly tore the boys out of the hut and further away as they marched back towards the village. Senna knew that Arthur only held back for Aiden's sake. As soon as they'd put a long enough distance between the hut, Arthur would explode. As usual. Chapter 10. John. John's hands trembled. He vividly remembered this dream that had caused him to collapse, and here she was, coming to haunt him. When he saw her sitting there, he knew he had a decision to make, a decision granted to him alone, to accept fate and live through everything despite the consequences, or to run. It felt as if two voices yelled inside of him, and he did not know how to make them stop. Sina and Arthur were involved in some kind of feud, but John barely noticed. He was preoccupied with those thoughts that threatened to tear him apart. "Who do you think you are?" Arthur said, suddenly stopping. John nearly bumped into him. His rage was directed at Sena, who eyed him, half amused. "What do you mean?" Arthur clenched his fists, like he always did, to soften the anger inside of him. He was searching for words, but found none. "Well, it was me who—" "Are you jealous?" Sena interrupted. Arthur's eyes widened. He was jealous, wasn't he? But this meant that— "I'm not jealous of you," he replied. It was a lie. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You're not a threat." "Well then, you can relax, can't you?" A pause, while a cunning smile appeared in Sena's face. "And watch me while I swoop her right under your nose." Arthur exploded and ran towards Sena, fists ahead. John stood in his way. "Hey!" He tried to push Arthur away, who pressed in with raging eyes. "Stop!" When Arthur finally gave in, John pushed him away, eyeing the two of them with reproach. "What's wrong with you?" Both fell silent, and Arthur made a deep breath. "All right, I suggest nobody makes a move, for our friendship's sake." His posture was still strong and threatening. "Promise." Sena hesitated. "Promise." Arthur pushed, and Sena nodded. "I promise." "Good, I promise to stay away from her as well," Arthur said, and this promise seemed to have cost him everything. Both of them shifted their gaze to John now. He studied their faces. His hands trembled again. "Will you run away, John? Or will you face your trials?" Those memories, those images played out in his mind's eye again and again. But when the fear left, he realized that this was irreversible, that this was the only way he wanted it. He lowered his head. "I cannot make such a promise." Both of them stared in disbelief, lost for words. How could he explain this to them? Something not even he quite understood. "It wouldn't be fair to make a promise I can't keep." Arthur's hands shook, and he clenched them into fists yet again. Was he really that serious about her? It was foolish. He had only met her today, and it wasn't like she was the only girl around here. But John had known her for years, it felt. "I don't understand," Sena began, and he couldn't. John wanted to explain it to them, make them understand, but there were no words he could find. So he remained silent. "You think you are so special, don't you?" Arthur exclaimed, furious. "You've been chosen by the gods. You're better than us?" Arthur came closer, piercing him with reproach, holding back a punch. John endured the stare. "She doesn't belong to you, and you cannot predict the future. You just want to be special because your parents abandoned you." Sena looked back and forth between them. "Arthur, stop," he whispered, but Arthur paid no attention. "You know what? You're not special, and you never were. You'll see when you realize she'll be mine, not yours." With this, Arthur gave him a nudge. John remained steadfast, eyes not backing away from Arthur's stare. Sena lowered his head. "So here's the thing." A voice suddenly interrupted, and all of them shrunk back. Alistair McKeon stood at the edge of the village, eyeing them. His fury from this evening had subsided. "Stay away from her, all of you. This is not a suggestion. It's a command. If I see any of you near her or near this hut again, you will regret it. Bitterly. Understood?" Alistair looked around, waiting for everyone to nod. His tone left no room for disagreement, His eyes remained on Arthur. "As always, we'll discuss your punishment in the morning." With this, he turned around and left. Arthur threw one last look at John, miming, "She's mine." Sina exhaled and shook his head, leaving in the other direction. Only John stood there for another moment, not noticing the cold anymore. His life was suddenly thrown upside down, and although he knew this day was coming, it still ached. When he strolled towards the village, something felt wrong, as if a presence had been observing them, eavesdropping on them. He looked around, but it was impossible to see anything in this darkness. He let out a deep breath and went inside the hut where his grandfather snored louder than usual.